Well, thank you very much for this warm introduction. I'm deeply honored to be here. The original reason for being here is that I'm part of an international accreditation panel that has visited all your medical schools in Israel for accreditation purposes. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to look into your medical education situation. Then naturally, while I was here, the Medical Association asked if I could do a talk on assessment, which is indeed my specialty and which I love to do. I'm going to talk about, I've been in medical education almost 40 years now. I lived through a whole bunch of developments and eras. And what I'm going to do is to summarize a bit of that history for assessment. And I'm going to discuss 3 paradigms with you that I think we can distinguish in the development of the history of assessment in medical education. And I think these 3 paradigms are relevant both for undergraduates as well as postgraduate training. And I'll go through each of them and perhaps sketch you what might be becoming important in the future. Here are the 3 paradigms: assessment of learning, the assessment for learning, and a more systems approach to assessment. I'll sketch each of them, and then the things that we learned from that paradigm as a sort of from a helicopter view. Naturally, we've been working hard in assessment in medical education, and climbing this pyramid. Anyone not knowing Miller's pyramid? No, we all know Miller's pyramid. But basically, we have been climbing it with all kinds of instruments, all kinds of methods, right? So our toolbox of methods of assessment is really well filled. Okay? Now let's look at the assessment of learning paradigm, the first paradigm. This is the classic paradigm of looking at assessment, which is basically looking at how we can use standardized assessment to assess performance. And the focus is on the summative examination, right? The paradigm is about having a course. At the end of the course, you have an exam of some kind, and you pass or fail, and you move on to the next exam. This is the traditional approach to assessment. The emphasis was very much on reliability, validity, and certainly objectivity. Everything needs to be objective, right? And any removal of human judgment was important, because any human judgment will bring in bias, will be unreliable, and should be removed from the assessment. This is the most traditional paradigm that probably most institutions still embrace. The lessons that we learned from this paradigm, this is a long paradigm. This took decades, really, this paradigm, this more psychometric paradigm. And the lessons that we learned is that, for example, in clinical reasoning assessment, simple written scenarios will do, and will do best. There's been a lot of research on all kinds of simulations, complex simulations, to assess clinical reasoning. They didn't work. Simple scenario-based assessments do a good job in assessing clinical reasoning. The other thing that we learned is that there's a whole lot of osceology that emerged from the 70s, right? And the original OSCE is assessing bits and pieces. We move towards OSCEs that are much more authentic for the actual realistic situation in clinical practice, where we have longer stations usually, and where we assess the learners not with checklists, tick, 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 but with global rating scales. Global rating scales are more subjective, but they seem to be more valid to differentiate between expertise of learners. So, use these authentic OSCEs and use global rating scales. What we also learned is that if you have some quality assurance around your test development, that will have a large impact on the quality of your assessment. What do I mean by quality control? For example, peer review of exam questions, right? Simple peer review, going through your items and critique them. Another part of quality control might be some psychometric analysis as part of your post-exam evaluation. Do some analysis which are relatively simple, and you may improve the quality of your exams significantly. Right. Then what we learned, this is an important one, that whatever that you're measuring it with, you must be aware that any sort of performance is strongly contextually bound. And therefore, if you assess properly, you need to assess across many, many contexts, right? So you need to sample widely across content. And this has been time and over investigated. And I'm going to show you a slide with reliability coefficients. Won't scare you, but if I were to measure your length, and I have a ruler, and I would do it twice, then I would expect a high correlation between the first measure and the second measure. That is what reliability is. It is expressed on a scale from 0 to 1, 0, no reliability at all, 1, perfect reliability. They say that a summative exam, an exam with consequences, needs at least a reliability of 0.80. I'm going to show you a table with different methods of assessment, multiple choices, short cases, patient management problem, which is a clinical reasoning technique, oral exam, long case, OSCE, mini CEX, video assessment, and incognito standardized patients. And for each of these methods, the reliability is estimated. And it's expressed as a function of testing time in order to make these numbers comparable across different methods of assessment. So if I say that a reliability of 0.80 would be the minimum, what will be your conclusion in relation to this table? Yeah, you need long testing time before you can come up with a reliable score. Yet, in other words, most of our exams in educational practice are not very reliable. You have to be very careful with making heavy decisions based on a single measurement. Yet, in other words, one measure is no measure, right? You'll make significant pass-fail decision errors simply based on unreliability. This has been found time and over again in the literature. This is bad news. But there's also good news in this slide. You can't say that the more objective measures have more reliability than the more subjective measures. For example, the oral exam is a very subjective exam, right? Still, if you sample sufficient orals, you will get a reliable picture. From a historic perspective, clinical assessments were often based on orals. And we didn't like the subjectivity of that. Therefore, Ronald Harden invented the OSCE. Look at the name, Objective Structured Clinical Examination. So he sought to improve reliability by standardization and by objectification. But with many years later, with a lot of research, we know that it's not in the standardization nor the objectification that you book reliability, but it's in the sampling, right? And even if you have very subjective judgments, you can have good reliability provided that you sample sufficiently. Oh yes, a single oral exam will be unreliable, but so will be a single item multiple choice test. So will be a single station OSCE. You need to sample widely across content. That's an imperative. Okay, and then we learned that assessment drives learning. And particularly for learners, there's nothing more important than the way they're being assessed, right? They do anything to pass the test. But a lot of that driving effect is not very positive. I think if I look at the most common approach in assessment practice, course, exam, course, exam, course, exam, then I think this is the kind of learning that we promote. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the forget curves in psychology, but if you learn something for the occasion, 50% is gone after a couple of weeks. So what's the point in doing this? In the meantime, things changed in education. First of all, we saw the emergence of competency-based medical education. And I'll come back to that extensively. And then we saw changes in the didactic approach of learning and instructional formats. I myself, I come from a university, the whole university uses problem-based learning as an instructional approach. And we've been doing that since 1974, right? So these student-centered learning, newer approaches emerged, which put a lot more emphasis on self-directed learning and reflection. Okay? And we also saw the emergence of work-based assessment. Assessment in the actual clinical workplace. Assessing in the actual workplace, where you observe someone and then give feedback. This is work-based assessment, which is emerging worldwide. This is all driven by societal demands, what healthcare needs in the future, and also driven by education theory, because there's a lot of educational theory out there, and we know a lot what works and doesn't work in education. Right, if we look at the competency-based medical education, different countries have developed different competency-based systems. And here are three. You're probably familiar with them, right? These are three competency frameworks that have been developed not overnight. They have been developed with a lot of stakeholder input, looking at what healthcare needs in the future. And if you look at these systems, then a couple of things strike me, really. First of all, they're very similar to each other. Particularly if you start looking underneath, they're pretty much similar. The second thing that really strikes me is that most of those competencies are non-medical, are more generic. Quite interesting, huh? They focus on areas as communication, leadership, working together, teamwork, all those kind of softer competencies. There's good reason for that, because we know that if things go wrong in clinical practice, these kind of skills are involved. I had one PhD doing an investigation of the hospital complaints in my university hospital. 80%, more than 80% of all the complaints were related to communication, exactly. We also have good evidence that if you do well in the labor market, these kind of skills are important. And we also have evidence that if there are problems in relation to some of those skills, for example, professionalism, in actual clinical practice, they could already have been seen in the undergraduate training program. So we have an obligation to teach, monitor, and assess those kind of complex skills. Because they're complex. Define professionalism for me. Very difficult. Try and put that into a checklist. Very, very difficult. So these kind of complex skills are essentially behavioral, right? They're not cognitive. They're behavioral. So that basically means that we have to assess them with non-standardized methods, and I'll show you. But I also think it's important that we have lots of evidence that if you pay attention to those kind of skills, they grow. If you don't pay explicit attention to these skills, don't expect them to grow. So if you have a postgraduate training program that pays no attention specifically to communication training, communication will not automatically improve, right? And then finally, you can look at these competencies as your longitudinal strands throughout a training program. You can't have a course on communication, do an OSCE, and you are a good communicator for the rest of your life. It doesn't work that way. These kind of skills need to be nurtured all the time. And I actually think both at the undergraduate level as well as at the postgraduate level. Right, so basically we need to assess these kind of skills in the top of Miller's pyramid. So we should actually reverse Miller's pyramid and assess them with unstandardized assessment, which is more subjective, right? So we can only do that by professional judgment through direct observation and interpretation. And we have a bunch of assessment instruments that we have developed in order to assess these kind of skills. And many of them are available. Right, so CBME is really important. And I actually hope that Israel will either adopt one of these frameworks or will develop one of these frameworks on your own. And I certainly hope that you will do that in connection to undergraduate training. I think you should adopt a competency framework for the whole continuum of medical education. So there's some work to do, I think. Right. That brings me to my second paradigm, which is the assessment for learning paradigm. Now, the attention is to use the assessment to promote learning, to actually use assessment to provide feedback to the learner. It's to really use the assessment to give feedback, and assessment becomes part of learning, right? So it's all about giving feedback. The assessment should generate feedback. Actually, what we typically do in educational practice is to give learners grades. Well, grades are the poorest form of feedback you can get, right? And particularly if we talk about complex skills. You know, if you were to grade me for my performance here, and you would give me a 7 on a 10-point scale, great. What should I do next? Yeah, get an 8. But how? The grade itself is meaningless, right? So we need to focus on feedback. And I'll give you a couple of examples how we give feedback in Maastricht. Here's one example, which is a quantitative example. This is undergraduate medical training. I didn't have availability of some of the postgraduate slides. But we administer a progress test every 3 months, 4 times a year. A written exam, which is kind of a final examination. And we monitor the growth of the student on this exam. The student can go online and find his longitudinal scores like this, which is then compared to the scores of the cohort. But he or she can do that for their total scores, but also for their anatomy scores, or their total basic sciences scores, or their surgery scores, or their total clinical scores. So this provides a very deep information for the learner. Here's an example from work-based assessment where the computer generates these spider reports on all of the competencies. We in the Netherlands have adopted the CanMEDS framework. So here are the 6 roles of the CanMEDS. By the way, nationally, so this is a national competence framework. And here you see the computer has generated the scores of an individual on each of the competencies in relation to the full cohort. So the learner gets a lot of feedback. Here's a very important function of the electronic portfolio as we have it. That is, generate for me all the narrative data on this particular learner. And you can see actually how this learner is developing. So you have both quantitative and qualitative information that provides you a good monitoring over the development of the growth of an individual in each of the competencies. What do we learn? Lessons learned from this particular paradigm. We learned that if you introduce work-based assessment in a summative way, it's bound to fail. Because people will start playing games. And it should be focused on authentic feedback, not on gaining points, right? So do it as formatively as possible. We also have learned that in a summative system, the introduction of feedback is simply ignored by learners. They pass the exam, they don't care anymore, right? Who cares? And then we understood that feedback is not a one-sided stream of the one to the other, feedback is a dialogue. And the best way is to give feedback in a Socratic dialogue. Well, you've just seen this patient. What were you thinking about in the beginning? What else could it have been? Did you explore that? Did you observe the response of the patient when you said this? How would you do this differently a next time? Okay, please, would you mind making a summary of this, of our conversation, and upload it to your portfolio? And I have a data point. And then we've learned, and I spoke about it as well, that narrative information has a lot more impact than quantitative information. We have a phenomenal tool, that's language. Let's use that if we talk about assessment. Right, and then finally, also a really important one, that is that the instrument in this paradigm is not so important as is the interaction between the person giving feedback and the person receiving feedback. The quality of that interaction will determine the utility, the value of that assessment. And giving feedback is a skill and actually requires a lot of staff development. So if you want to engage in developing work-based assessment, which is relevant to give feedback to the individual, then you have to train your people. By the way, there's a lot of research that learners in clinical practice receive little feedback on their actions and are relatively little directly observed. So we need to improve that in clinical practice. And then finally, certainly for me, after 40 years of problem-based learning, self-directed learning requires a lot of directing. And we do that through mentoring and coaching. We provide coaches to our learners who follow the student throughout, who monitor their growth in the different competencies, and to have regular reflective dialogues with their learners. One of my PhD students from the UK actually asked himself, can feedback in a summative context be formative? The short answer is no. He actually says we need to move away from this traditional behavioristic summative approach to assessment. He says it's a dead end. Right, that brings me then to my final paradigm, which is a more systems integrated paradigm. What it basically does, it integrates the lessons from the two other paradigms. And it's focusing not so much on the individual method of assessment, but on the assessment program as a whole. So you look at the whole assessment program and optimize it, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And one of the major examples of this way of thinking is programmatic assessment. And I'll explain to you what programmatic assessment is. In programmatic assessment, any individual assessment action is considered to be a single data point. A single data point is meant to give feedback. A single data point is not fit and should not take pass-fail decisions. So pass-fail decisions are being taken away from individual assessment activities, right? It's only meant for feedback. And then there's a mix of different methods. I'm kind of agnostic to method of assessment. I don't care. I only care about your justification, your educational justification for using this particular method at that moment in time. And if you do a good job, you let your learners verbalize over here, write over there, defend over there, and so on and so forth. There's a mixture of different approaches, methods. And then, naturally, you have to take decisions. These are higher stake decisions. But the number of data points and the stake of the decision is related to each other. Let me show you that later more. And also there's a constant dialogue with the learner to promote self-directed learning and to interpret the feedback. And then finally, very high-stake decisions, for example, promotion to the next year, is taken by a committee of experts, a competence committee. Let me put that in other words. A single data point is focused on feedback, right? Is not there to take any pass-fail decisions. Then people assemble all kinds of data points. Somewhere along the way, maybe there's an intermediate assessment, which is maybe halfway through the year, and will judge the growth in the portfolio, right? And the learner will know where he or she stands, or what needs to be improved, right? Then, for example, at the end of the year, we need to pass or fail. We need to take a high-stake decision that has a lot of consequences. We can only do that if we have a lot of data points, right? So the stakes and the number of data points are related. Or yet in other words, if you consider one data point a single pixel in a photograph, you don't see the picture, right? You have to add pixels to the photograph in order to see the bigger picture. And once you're able to see the bigger picture and you have sufficient data points, then you can take a decision. So this is the essence of programmatic assessment. It's been used both at the undergraduate level and certainly also a lot in the postgraduate arena over the world. And it has become quite popular. A lot of is published on programmatic assessment, including a recent initial review on programmatic assessment. And if you go to my personal homepage, you can find those papers if you wish. They're available on this website. Right. So the lessons that we learned from this third paradigm is that programmatic assessment will only work if it fits to your education model. If you have a very traditional education model, which is very modular, which doesn't have any longitudinal components, then programmatic assessment is of no use to you. You need to have a more constructivist approach to education, and then programmatic assessment is really valuable. And then you're able to truly achieve a learning culture. And what is really important is the implementation itself. You have to convince quite a lot of people to have their role in programmatic assessment. They need to understand what their role is. It's very difficult to say to someone, you cannot pass or fail your learners anymore. That's not your task. Your task is to provide information. And the passing and the failing will be done elsewhere when we have sufficient data. And if you start this programmatic approach, you need quite a lot of change. And you need leadership. And you need to involve your stakeholders right from the start. And you need a lot of faculty development in terms of people giving feedback, being able to give feedback. Because that's the biggest challenge in programmatic assessment, to get the feedback right. Okay, I'm not going to discuss this table, which is more theoretically interesting. I'll come to the conclusion that assessment has dramatically changed over time, and that we've gone through different perspectives, different paradigms of assessment. And I think the real question is, where are you? In which paradigm are you? And where would you like to go? And I hope you'll reflect on that. And I'm open for questions if you wish, if I may. I'm not sure if I may, but.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. We learned a lot. We're just in Israel at the beginning of the whole process. And as you can see here, there are quite a lot of people who are interested in implementing that. And I would refer to the last part of your talk. How long does it take to make this change in people's mind, and what does it take to get them to go for a programmatic assessment and not to the things we are all used to for quite a long time? Thank you.
I think what is important is that professionals get more acquainted with all the knowledge from medical education. There's a lot of knowledge out there. It is also probably one of the conclusions from my undergraduate review. There is relatively little medical education expertise within the country. So I think it's really important to develop that. And I think it's important to work on your medical education literacy of doing these kind of things. And then it takes time. And to me, educational innovation is not so much an issue of educational ideas or technology, but is a matter of change management. How do you get all these people to come along with you? Because we as teachers all have our own individual conceptions on teaching, which is formed by our own learning experiences. And it's pretty hard to change those, but they need to be changed. Staff development, meetings like this, workshops, improve your literacy.
You want to come give a course here? Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you again for a wonderful talk. Basically, what we are doing, we are coming from subjective, like in apprentice education, through objective to subjective again.
Subjective again.
how do you neutralize the cultural differences or gender differences that can influence this evaluation?
There's more risk of bias if it's going to be more subjective. But I also think that we need to shift our minds around objectivity and subjectivity. In the first paradigm, and I'm a learner, and I'm getting feedback from her, and I'm getting feedback from her. But they both focus on different things. In a paradigm one thinking, this is bias, right? Mm-hmm. Because they are not calibrated. From a learning perspective, from the third perspective, there are different views on my learning is beneficial to my learning, right? And then, naturally, if we take high-stake decisions, we need to be very careful with biases, like from gender or other biases. In actual practice, the whole notion of programmatic assessment has two parts. That is the learning part, and there's the decision part. So far, my experiences say that the decision part is really easy. We hardly have any problems. The learning part is much more complex because you have to get your people to provide good feedback. And if the feedback isn't good, then we know it's not credible, and uncredible feedback is just ignored by learners.
So by diversities and multiplies...
diversity, the fact that you have so many different judges, you have so many different data points, then you reduce your bias. And it's really important to look at the triangulation of information across data points. Okay. That makes it strong.
I would like to ask you, who and how can we teach the tutor, the coacher that will teach our resident and the people? I think this is one of the main issues.
Teach your leaders or teach your clinicians?
To teach my colleagues.
Your colleagues, yeah.
Yeah, how to teach others.
I'm flying back tonight to the Netherlands, Monday back to the office. Wednesday, I have a full training day with clinicians on work-based assessment, right? And I'll go to a hospital and I'll have one of my clinical colleagues join me, and we'll do a whole day on how to give feedback in a clinical workplace. And we will do role plays. We'll invite you to come to sit in the hot seat and give feedback to this particular learner. And we will give you feedback on how you do this. So staff development, it's all staff development. What strikes me, if we do these kind of training programs, that the skills that you need in order to do a good job for giving feedback are very similar to your clinical skills with patient interaction. Asking open-ended questions, checking if the information is understood, providing a summary, all very similar tactics, but now you apply it to a learning situation. Staff development, staff development, staff development. And you need to have an infrastructure for that, which is important and not easy to achieve. Yep.
Thank you for that eye-opening. I have a question. Surgery is very much an objective kind of, actually. When we do surgery, we try to teach our young residents to do it as objectively, as orderly as possible. And if I understand you correctly, you want an overall assessment, so of the soft competencies and of the harder ones in surgery. Do you have a way of integrating all those competencies into one assessment?
Yeah, we do one assessment. So we integrate it into one assessment at the end. But you have to pass each of the competencies. So in surgery, you would have to pass being a medical expert, which would be your more objective type of knowledge and clinical actions that you do. But you also have to pass your communication. You also have to pass your professionalism. And in the high-stake decision-making, you have to pass all the competencies. I'm flying home tonight, middle of the night. And the pilot that is trained in front, he was really good in starting up and in interpreting all the meteorological information. He was not so good in landing, but on average, right? So we don't compensate between competencies, right? And even surgery has its soft side.
Thank you very much. Sorry about the term, but all the process of CBME is very important, but it's also time-consuming. What do you think is the best tool to integrate it in our everyday workload so it will be more easy or more efficient way?
Yeah, education will take time, no doubt. And if you introduce a system of work-based assessment in the clinical workplace, then you have to integrate it in your daily routine. If you don't do that, then it won't work. Part of that workshop I will give on Wednesday, the end of the day, we'll discuss this. How can we bring this to the busy clinical workplace? And then people come up with different solutions. For example, here's a group of surgeons, and he is responsible this week for providing all the feedback to the residents. And next week, it will be his responsibility. In my own academic hospital, the person making the itinerary of the outpatient clinic simply schedules feedback moments. So it's become part of your routine. If it's not part of your routine, it's not going to work. And it doesn't need to take long. Just like I gave you an example of a short dialogue, which you then ask the learner to capture, to write it down. It doesn't need to take a lot of time. And then the principle of less is more. Do this less, but really well, than do it superficially and many times.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very last comment you want to give? Shortly, please.
Shortly? I just want to give you a summative assessment of you out of 10. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a small present of gratitude and appreciation for your wonderful talk and your willingness to come. And I think that most of the audience, if not all of them, want you to come back again and again.